You've probably seen or heard of movies like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Silence of the Lambs, and Psycho. These are all horror stories that you could not imagine to be real. But what if I told you characters from these movies were inspired by an actual person? This person was a man by the name of Ed Gein. Ed Gein was known to be an outcast. He didn't grow up in the best household. After the loss of his mother, he would go on to say that he lost his only friend and one true love. While he was odd both as a child and as an adult, no one in Plainfield, Wisconsin knew what kind of heinous and disturbing crimes he would go on to commit. This is the true story of the real-life Leatherface, Ed Gein. Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, hi, my name is Monica. I like to post anti-MLM life and some true crime content here on this channel. So if any of that interests you, make sure to hit that subscribe button. I would love for you to stick around. In today's video, we are going to be talking about Ed Gein. If you know this case, then you know that if you have a weak stomach, there are certain parts of this that you probably will not want to watch. But I am going to issue a warning. Warning, the following presentation is intended for mature audiences. It contains graphic descriptions of crime scenes, adult dialogue, and adult language. Viewer discretion is advised. I do want to add, as well as I normally do in a lot of my true crime videos, that please do your own research. This is based on just some of the information that I was able to find online. All of my sources are always linked in the description box, but please also do your own research at the same time. If you don't know anything about Ed Gein, then you may have heard of movies such as Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Psycho, and Silence of the Lambs. Some characters in those movies were based off of Ed Gein. So for example, in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Leatherface. In Psycho, Norman Bates. And in The Silence of the Lambs, Buffalo Bill. I know that Ed Gein has probably been covered plenty of times, and I'm sure a lot of people watching this have already heard about this case, but I did just want to add this as one of the Spooktober true crime installments, I guess you could say, that I'm having here in the month of October. But without further ado, let's get into the video. Ed Gein was born Edward Theodore Gein on August 27, 1906 in La Crosse County, Wisconsin. His father and mother were George and Augusta Gein. Ed also had an older brother by the name of Henry, who was born in 1901. Unfortunately for Ed, he didn't really grow up in the best household. George was said to be an alcoholic, and allegedly because of this, he was not able to hold down a job. He did have a multitude of jobs, which included anywhere from being a carpenter to a tanner and even a salesman. Apparently, Augusta, Ed's mother, was not a huge fan of her husband. It was even said that at one point she would pray to God and hope that something would happen to her husband, or that somehow he would be killed, something along those lines. The Geins did have their own store. However, they would go on to sell it a few short years later because Augusta wanted to live away from the hustle and bustle and depravity of the city. This is when the Gein family would move to Plainfield, Wisconsin, and they decided to purchase a 155-acre farm around the year 1915. Not only did Augusta want to move away from the city because of just trying to stay away from all of the craziness and the chaos, but it was a way for her to be able to control her family, specifically her two sons, and she wanted to keep them away from the outside world. They would only leave the home to go to school. Ed's mother was incredibly religious, and she didn't want Henry and Ed to be influenced by anyone from the outside world, especially women. She believed that all women, except for herself, for whatever reason, were promiscuous and sent by the devil. Because of Augusta's religious life, every afternoon she would read the Bible to her boys. Henry and Ed helped their parents on the farm, so they really didn't have time for anything outside of going to school. They didn't really have time to have friends or a social life, anything of that nature. While in school, though, Ed was known to be somewhat of an outcast. His teachers and classmates thought he was very strange, especially because he would just randomly start laughing in the middle of class, and when they would ask him what he was laughing at, he would say that it was because he was laughing at his own inside jokes. Yes, that is what he was laughing at. Even when he did try to make some friends at school and he tried to be social, his mother would punish him for doing so. So while he was very socially awkward, he did pretty okay in school, and it would later be known that he had an average IQ. This is when we're going to fast forward quite a bit to the year 1940. On April 1st of 1940, when Ed was almost 34 years old, his father, George, would pass away from heart failure at the age of 66. Some thought that it was caused by George's alcoholism, but I was not able to find a legitimate source that it was that. It's just that the only thing I could find is that it was heart failure. This wasn't really a big deal to Ed because he was very, I would say, in my opinion, obsessed with his mother. So in his eyes, there was one less person in the picture. With his father gone, Ed and his brother Henry would have to step up and help their mother around the farm and help pay for their living expenses. This meant picking up odd jobs throughout the town, and they would be kind of like the handymen of Plainfield. On top of this as well, Ed would make a little extra money by babysitting the children of the people in the town. It was said that he really truly enjoyed babysitting because it's almost as if he got along better with the kids than he did with adults. In the future, Henry, his older brother, started to get a little worried for Ed. He was concerned with how attached Ed was to their mother, Augusta, and it wasn't really a normal mother-son bond. It was weird, and it was strange and odd. Henry had plans to move in with a woman that he had started dating. Apparently, she was a divorced mother of 2. But because of his concern for Ed, he started talking to Ed and kind of expressing how he felt about their mother because, as you can probably come to assume, she was very controlling and just completely out there. And honestly, I would not want to have a mother like that because very overbearing, had to have control over everything. And she sheltered these boys away from the world. She didn't want them to have any kind of influence from the outside world, but I mean, you have to experience life. You have to have these kinds of life experiences. It's part of growing up and becoming an adult and everything of that nature. But Henry would try to tell Ed that the relationship that Ed and Augusta had was unhealthy. As you can imagine, Ed was not too pleased about his brother telling him, and of course he didn't respond very well to these types of conversations. This brings us to May 16th of 1944. Henry and Ed were working on the farm and they were burning some kind of brush around the area when all of this sudden, the local fire department saw something in the sky that looked like a fire that had gotten out of control. So they quickly rushed to the Gein residence because that's where they saw this light in the sky coming from, and they put out the fire. However, Ed reported his brother missing. A search was underway that night, but somehow Ed was able to lead them to his brother's body. But nobody thought anything of it, even though when they found Henry, they did say that he died because of the fire. He died of asphyxiation from the smoke and everything. But when they found him, he had some kind of bruising on his head. After police found this bruising, they didn't have an autopsy done, and because they didn't believe that there was any kind of foul play here. Later on, the county coroner, like I said before, would mark the cause of death as asphyxiation. There has been speculation that Ed could have murdered his brother Henry, but he never admitted to it, and there was never any kind of evidence, and of course there was no autopsy done, so they didn't have any kind of proof that it could have been Ed. Ed's dreams have finally come true, and he has his mother all to himself. But this was short-lived. Not too long after Henry's death, Augusta suffered a stroke that would leave her paralyzed. Of course, Ed stepped up and took care of his mother all on his own, and sometime in 1945, Ed and his mother went to purchase straw from a man that lived in a nearby farm, and his name was Smith. This is where I'm going to issue a trigger warning for animal abuse, and Augusta witnessed Smith beating a dog, which he would eventually beat to death. However, before that, a woman came running out of the home and she started yelling at Smith for him to stop and to leave the dog alone and just screaming. Augusta was upset, but it wasn't because of the scene of this dog being killed. It was because of the woman that had come out of the home screaming, and she started calling this woman Smith's harlot because they were not married. Okay, Augusta. Okay, because that's what we should be worried about here. Not too long after this incident occurred, Augusta would suffer from yet another stroke. While she survived this second stroke as well, her health declined very, very rapidly, and this was due to her developing cancer. She would die on December 29th of 1945 at the age of 67. Ed was 39 at this time when his mother passed away, and he would go on to later say that he lost his only friend and his one true love. Ed was now all alone in this world that his mother isolated him from. He had basically no social skills. He had this farm that he had to take care of now, and he was just alone. And with him being alone with no friends or family, what is he supposed to do now? But Ed was stuck, like I said, he was stuck with this farm, and he had to take care of it all on his own. He would do exactly what he did when his father passed away, when him and his brother Henry were helping out his mother, and he would become the handyman around town yet again. What he ended up doing with the house was really weird, and this was after his mother passed away. Any rooms that were used by his mother, which included the upstairs, the downstairs parlor, along with the living room, which was basically most of the house because he was left with just the kitchen and then a small little parlor room type thing next to the kitchen that he would turn into a bedroom. But all of the other rooms that his mom at one point occupied were left in pristine condition. It was almost as if these rooms were like a shrine to his mother, even though his mother was no longer there, but everything was left just the way that she had left it. The rooms that Ed would occupy became just disgusting. There was stuff everywhere. He didn't really clean. He would read a lot of magazines and stories, and he was especially interested in anything that involved anatomy, cannibalism, and what was going on in the concentration camps during the Holocaust. It was almost as if he was fascinated with death and torture and cannibalism. Between the years of 1946 and 1956, Ed sold approximately 80 acres of the land that his brother had owned. For whatever reason, after Ed's mother died, it's almost as if something clicked in Ed's head. And even though he was very awkward and antisocial, very isolated from the outside world, it was just almost as if something happened psychologically in his head. And this is where we're going to start talking about his victims. There was a tavern in Pine Grove, Wisconsin that Ed had gone to several times. He met a woman who worked there, and her name was Mary Hogan, who was 51 years old. It's been said that there were times where Ed would make jokes, but he was kind of well known to have this weird, dark sense of humor, and people just kind of excused it because, oh, it's just Ed, he's just weird. But there were some times where he would make jokes telling Mary to go home because you never know when your last day on this earth is. Which brings me to December 8th of 1954. This would be the last day of Mary's life that Ed joked about in earlier times. Ed waited outside for all of Mary's customers to leave the tavern, and that's when he would eventually just walk into the tavern. Mary would tell him that she was closing and that he needed to leave. That's when he pulled out a .32 caliber pistol and shot her in the head, killing Mary instantly. According to one article, Ed had dragged her body onto a sled that he had apparently out back somewhere of this tavern, and it took about several hours for him to drag her body back to his farm. The following day, police were notified and called to the crime scene because there was a pool of blood that was found behind the bar. And police found a casing matching a .32 caliber pistol along with some overturned furniture. But because police hadn't found Mary's body or any report of her being missing, they didn't think that she was murdered. Great police work. So this woman is missing. There's blood behind the bar, but we're not going to think that she was murdered. We're not going to speculate and investigate this a little bit further. Okay, but I do have to remember that this is back a really long time ago, so maybe that's also another reason why. But now we're going to move on to November of 1957. During this town, there was a tradition amongst the men of the town where they would all go hunting together. The only time that they really truly came back into town is if they needed something. Of course, Ed did not go. However, prior to all of them leaving for this hunting trip, Ed talked to a sheriff by the name of Frank and his mother, Bernice Warden, who was a 58-year-old woman who worked at the local hardware store. This was a little odd to Frank because Ed wasn't really one to have a conversation with people because he was very shy and just socially awkward. Of course, Frank decided to have a little bit of small talk with Ed, letting him know that he would be out of town that weekend because of the hunting trip. And on November 16th of 1957, Ed would walk into this hardware store that Bernice worked at when she was closing. Bernice didn't see this, but once he walked in, he locked the door behind him. He would end up walking to the back of the store and picking up a .22 caliber rifle that was somewhere in the back of the store. What Bernice unfortunately didn't know was that he had a bullet in his pocket that he would put into this rifle and use to shoot her. Ed shot Bernice in the head just as he did with Mary just a few years earlier. Once Ed got Bernice's body into the back of his car, he went to steal some cash out of the drawer, and I'm going to theorize that it was because he was trying to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Frank Warden would return from his hunting trip and go to the store. It was around 5 p.m. and he noticed that it had been locked. When other townspeople, when he talked to them, they all said, oh, well, we thought it was just because of the hunting trip, so we just thought maybe it was closed because of that. Frank would break into the hardware store, and that is when he would find a pool of blood behind the counter, along with some handwritten sales slips that his mother wrote out. It was in his mother's handwriting for some antifreeze. He remembered that when he was talking to Ed that the night before, that he said he was going to come back for a gallon of antifreeze the following morning. Ed would be arrested, and of course he went on to deny everything, saying he had nothing to do with it, he has no idea what happened. But then police would go to Ed's home and investigate. What they discovered next was absolutely horrifying. The sheriff's deputy walked into Ed's shed, and when he walked in there, he was just looking around, but he bumped into something. So of course he decided to take a look at it, And when he saw what he had bumped into, it was Bernice's body, which had been decapitated, and it was hanging upside down. And according to officials, her torso was, quote, dressed out like a deer, end quote. And what Ed had done to her body happened after her death. So this woman was decapitated and gutted, basically. This next part is pretty gruesome. So if you have a weak stomach, I will pop up a timestamp somewhere, because just so you can skip it, because it has to do with what they found in the house, and it includes a lot of, how would I say this, body parts amongst other things. So again, I'll put a timestamp up so that you can just skip it. If you decided to stick around and find out what they found in his home, let's just get into it. Remember Mary Hogan from just a few years earlier, and police said that they couldn't really look into it because she hadn't been reported missing and they couldn't find her body? Well, they found Mary Hogan's face that was made into a mask in a paper bag, along with her skull was found in a box. Bernice Warden's head had nails and twine in it and this was found in a burlap sack, because Ed would later go on to say he wanted to hang it as a wall decoration or as a trophy. Bernice's heart was in a plastic bag. There were soup bowls that were made from human skulls, a belt that was made from a bunch of women's nipples, 4 noses, a wastebasket made from human skin that had been made into a covering for seats for a chair. There were skulls on his bedpost, along with a corset that was made from a female torso, leggings that were made from human skin, a pair of lips that were on a window shade drawstring thing. So like on the curtain when you have the little pull thing, yep, there was a pair of lips on that. A few masks that were made from the skin of women's head. It was said that there was 9 of them. Body parts from women's lower region. So they found female genitalia, fingernails, along with a young girl's dress, and of course lower body parts from 2 underage girls who were said to be about 15 years old. Once investigators told Ed what they had found in his home, of course at this point there's no more denying it, there's no more lying on his part. It did take a little bit for him to start opening up and confessing to everything and talking about everything, but he would tell investigators between the ages of 1947, so 2 years after his mother passed away, and 1952, he made about 40 visits to local cemeteries. He would allegedly have some kind of worker that he befriended who would help him exhume these bodies. The way that he would find out about these bodies is he would look through obituaries. He would tend to look for women who were middle-aged and that reminded him of his mother. He would take these bodies home and tanned their skins and made objects like I spoke about earlier. Eventually, he told investigators that he wanted to have some fresher bodies because the skin of the bodies that he exhumed were drier than he was hoping for, and it made it harder for him to make these disturbing objects that were found in his home. It's been said that Ed started to create a woman's suit and even wear some of the skin. And some have believed that it could be because he was experimenting with his sexual orientation or that he was trying to become his mother. And remember, his mother had this really big hatred for women. So maybe he had this fascination with women and the body of a woman because he just never really had the chance to see it. So that might be something to think about. When they asked him if he had sex with any of these bodies, he responded and said no, because they smelled too bad. Well, on November 21st of 1957, Ed would go to court and enter his plea for 1 count of first-degree murder. This plea was not guilty by reason of insanity. Ed would be diagnosed with schizophrenia, and they said that he was mentally incompetent and unfit for trial. Because of this, he would be sent to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, which was a maximum security hospital. He was later transferred to Mendota State Hospital. On March 30th, 1958, while he was, of course, in the hospital and everything, there was an auction that was scheduled to auction off some of Ed's belongings. So, of course, his home had become somewhat of a tourist attraction. Just 10 days before the auction on March 20th, the house was mysteriously burned to the ground. They never figured out exactly what happened, but of course there is speculation that it was arson. When authorities told Ed about what had happened to his home, his response was, quote, "just as well," end quote. However, there was one thing that made it through the fire, and this was Ed's 1949 Ford sedan, which was used to move the bodies of his victims. It sold at an auction, and at the time it was sold for $760, which nowadays would be approximately anywhere between $6,000 to $7,000 is what I was finding online. The person who did get this car worked for a carnival and ended up turning it into one of the carnival's attractions. So it's just like back in the day when you would go and it would be the bearded lady and the acrobats that can bend their bodies in all different contorted ways and stuff like that. Well, Ed's car turned into one of those attractions that people paid for. The good thing is that Ed Gein didn't get any money from these attractions and people seeing his car. And I honestly don't know if I would have paid to see the car, because on one hand, I don't think I would, but on the other hand, I've watched all of the movies that had characters based off of him. So is that really any better? Because I've watched Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original and the remakes. I mean, there's been more than one remake, right? There's been more than one. I've watched all of them. There's Psycho, and then there's The Silence of the Lambs. So is it really any better than these people who were paying for this attraction to see his car? I mean, I know that the movies, it was kind of fictional, and I mean, yes, they were based off of certain things that Ed Gein did, but I don't know. I don't know how to feel about it. So you guys let me know in the comment section if you would have paid to see his car. But anyway, let's move on to the year 1968. And this is when doctors determined that Ed was finally fit for trial. His trial began on November 7th of 1968. Ed previously talked to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist later testified that Ed had told him he didn't know if killing Bernice was accidental or if he did it on purpose. He didn't really remember much from killing her. On November 14th of 1968, just a week after the trial began, Ed was found guilty of the murder of Bernice Warden, but was also found insane during the murder. So he was committed to the same Central State Hospital, yet again, the one for the criminally insane. And that's where he would live out the rest of his days. Ed would die at the age of 77 on July 26th of 1984, and he died due to respiratory failure because of his lung cancer. He was buried in Plainfield, Wisconsin. However, people would chip off pieces from his headstone as a souvenir, I guess. Why you would do that is beyond me, but I mean, that's what happened. Eventually, the entire headstone would be stolen in the year 2000, and then it would be found in June of 2001 somewhere near Seattle. Because of this, the county sheriff's department decided that they were just going to take the entire headstone and put it in storage at the sheriff's department. Ed now lies at an unmarked grave, but people still come to his grave. There's been pictures of people leaving flowers and stuff for him, which I think is a little weird, but maybe that's just me. There was some kind of speculation that Ed maybe had ties to other weird and mysterious disappearances that happened in Wisconsin. During the late 1940s and 1950s, the police of Wisconsin started to notice that there was an increase in missing persons cases. There were 4 cases that went unsolved. The first one was that of an 8-year-old girl who was named Georgia Weckler. On May 1st of 1947, she was on her way home from school when she just mysteriously disappeared. A search went underway by both police and people of the community. Georgia was never found, but there were tire marks where she had been last seen, and the marks that were found were of a Ford. So, of course, there was speculation that Ed maybe had something to do with it, but after further investigation, none of the body parts that they found at his home or his farmhouse were that of Georgia. So her case it went unsolved. 6 years after Georgia went missing, another girl by the name of Evelyn Hartley, who was 15 years old, also disappeared. She was babysitting, and her father was trying to call the home that she was babysitting at, and there was no answer. So he was a little concerned. He decided to go over to the house, knock on the door, make sure everything was okay, but there was no answer when he knocked on the door. He decided to start kind of looking through the windows and see if maybe he could find his daughter. Maybe something had happened to her or something along those lines. And when he looked through one of the windows, he found her shoes and her glasses that were on the floor. The entire house was locked except for the back basement window. And on that very same window that he tried to get into, and he eventually did get into the house, but with that window, he found that there was blood stains around it. So, of course, once he finally got into the home, he looked and he couldn't find his daughter. So he called police almost as soon as he could. And they came to the scene. They discovered that there were signs of a struggle. They would find blood stains on the grass outside, along with a bloody handprint that was on one of the neighbors' houses. There were also bloody footprints and a shoe that was found in the basement, on the basement floor. A few days later, they found her bloody clothes near a highway, and she was never found. In November of 1952, there were 2 men who stopped at a bar in Plainfield before they decided to go hunting. Their names were Victor Travis and Ray Burgess. Unfortunately, they had disappeared along with the car that they had been driving. And although none of these cases were linked back to Ed Gein, who knows? Because these are all mysterious disappearances that happened in the general area and the general vicinity of where he lived. So it would have been, I wouldn't say necessarily easy, but the fact that they couldn't find any evidence or any links that went back to Ed Gein, but it is a possibility, and at this point all we can do is just speculate about it. So that is the case of Ed Gein. What did you guys think about this man? Because when I was reading about the case, and when I started reading, I've known about this case for a really long time, but I thought it was a good true crime to have for my October series. And like I said, I knew about this, and I knew that a lot of movies were based off of him. I knew that I just knew of the horrifying things and disturbing things that he did. But have you guys heard of it? I know some people that watch me, there are some times where there's a case that I think is kind of well known and some people have never heard of it before. But even when I was reading a little more in depth about all of this, I knew about all of the things that he did to these body parts that I spoke about earlier. I have a pretty strong stomach, but I'm not gonna lie, as I was reading it, and also I think the fact that when I was looking up stuff about Ed Gein, some of the pictures that popped up showed the things that he made, the disturbing things that he made. And I think just thinking about that and having that image in my head is what just made me really, really sick to my stomach. And like I said, I don't have a weak stomach, but this case, yeah, it did a number. And just knowing that some of the things that he made and some of the masks and stuff that he made and that he wore it, I mean, how disturbed do you have to be to do something like that? You have to be very, very disturbed in your brain to be able to do something like that. And I really hope that the victims, even the victims that maybe we don't know about, or maybe the cases that I talked about before, the mysterious disappearances, if they were victims of Ed Gein, I truly hope that all of them are resting in peace. I hope that, because I watched some interviews with people of the town and I did watch some documentaries, and it seemed as though the town couldn't escape Ed Gein for a very long time because it became a tourist attraction. And I think it's because a lot of people just couldn't fathom that someone like this, that someone like this even existed. And I think the fact that so many movies came out that were based off of certain things that he did, that also kind of, I guess, what's a good word for it? Hyped it up or glorified Ed Gein. I don't even know how to say it, but it became a tourist attraction. And I'm sure that the people of the town, all they wanted to do is just move forward with their lives. The families just wanted to be able to mourn the deaths, the brutal, brutal, tragic deaths of their loved ones. And here you have all of these people making a big spectacle of it. So I hope that the town has calmed down a lot since then, and I hope that they're finally able to just go on with their lives, be able to live as normal as they possibly can, because a lot of times we see things like this happen, and these small towns, they don't want to be known for these serial killers or these murders, which is another thing. Talking about serial killers, some people said that Ed Gein was considered that he's considered a serial killer. What do you guys think of that? Because I don't know. I mean, he was classified as a serial killer, but I don't know if I would really I mean, I guess kind of, but I think at the same time too, a lot of people, when they think of serial killer, they think of the Green River Killer. They think of Ted Bundy. They think of people like that. And I don't know, it's the Zodiac Killer. That's another one. And I don't know, I mean, I guess he would be considered a serial killer, but I mean, we know that he murdered 2 people and that he was robbing graves, basically, of bodies. So, yeah, you guys, let me know what you think about this case and about Ed Gein in general. in the comment section below. And that's all that I have for you guys today. This is Monica reporting to you live from a highway. Bye.